So, day before yesterday, I started working on this idea. I got it from chatting with another streamer called Matty Morgs, who is an excellent streamer, does a lot of gaming streams where he talks about games, mostly D&D, uh, but he isn't specifically D&D. He's actually a game store owner, and he we had gotten into a discussion about Ravenloft and about the what's the word I'm looking for? And I had mentioned that I didn't think that modern D&D could do the actual Ravenloft setting. And it got me thinking, well, how would you do fantasy horror in D&D? Because you can do it, you just couldn't do it the way they did it in Ravenloft. So that's what I've been working on. But we are now at a crossroads. Which way to go? We could develop any number of things, right? We could start setting down some... We can start setting down map details and things like that, or we could start setting down character details and working out what classes are we going to use and all of that. And it's points like these that are points of horrific amounts of indecision on the part of any creator who is me. Maybe others too, but definitely ones who are me. I mean, I dropped an idea earlier for fighter subclass. As a note, I don't think I'm going to be using all of the classes. I don't honestly think that you necessarily should use all of the classes. I definitely don't think that that should be a default assumption. Right. Because there's 15 of them now if you include the Unearthed Arcana classes, because they have the Artificer and the Mystic. But even with just that core 13, they're covering an awful lot of territory with an awful lot of overlap. And you can set a lot of flavor just by which core classes you use, right? If you're in or actually, Hyperlanes is a great example. Hyperlanes is D&D as a space opera. It completely removed the magical elements, and instead of spells, you have gambits, which are the neat things that sci-fi heroes might do. And they only used a few of the classes, right? They used, the Bard, the Rogue, the Fighter, the Cleric. The Cleric was actually the interesting one, because the Cleric is the actual soldier class, right? Because the gambits that they use are all tactical gambits and munitions gambits and things that do tactical control and things like that. It's actually a really neat reskin of the Cleric. And incidentally, on the subject of it, yeah, there's nothing saying that a warlock is intentionally a warlock. In fact, I mean, I had the idea of warlocks, in one, when I was thinking about D&D, 5th Ed D&D at one point, I was considering the idea of warlocks being the primary wizard class, simply because it takes so much, instead of being devoted to an external power, it's an internal power, because it takes so much body modification to make you capable of using magic that you become something kind of other than what you were. That's actually a neat idea, and I might import that into this. I don't know, but I might. So instead of the warlock being, devoted to some higher power, they might actually be essentially branded by a mortal power that has, kind of done the pawn queen maneuver on them through this setting's equivalence to the body modification. I actually considered adapting the Warlock to hyperlanes for as the transhuman, which is, where I'm getting this idea. Definitely want to have a fighter. That's just kind of one of the bread and butters. Want to have a cleric because its importance to genre. Replace domains with professions. Faiths, don't know which term I want to go with. Gagner, something to keep in mind is that a lot of the powers that warlocks gain their power from aren't actually stated as being divine, right? Like, an archangel certainly is powerful, right? And an archangel is one of the potential sources of power. But it's not actually divine, right? It's an agent of the divine, so it's kind of an indirect link to the divine. And of course, the Archfey, and that's not really divine. Just don't tell it that. The Artificer might be kind of interesting. Because, I mean, the Ravenloft heritage, the Eremite class from 3.5 was, I mean, it wasn't really a class, it was a thing, but it was essentially the alchemist. And while the Artificer isn't written as the alchemist, you could easily write a subclass for it that is. I don't know if I wanted, though, because it looks like it would involve a lot of work. I don't know that I want a Barbarian. I never really liked the Barbarian in concept. I mean, I don't have a problem with the game stats per se, but the concept just, I can't adapt it to something that I like. Given the whole oppressive environments thing that we established earlier, I don't think the Bard would be appropriate for this. Because, I mean, we have the Cleric, which is our support type. The Bard is just a little bit too much of, making things, happy and better. Druid is a maybe. Although, honestly, I always tend to think of Druid as a Cleric subclass. Without him being an edgelord. I mean, you could say it's kind of an edgelord concept. Not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, overdramatic, trying to be awesome and moody. I mean, that's kind of a lot of the roleplay. Not necessarily the moody part, but overdramatic and trying to be awesome. That's a lot of roleplay, especially in D&D. How do we want? We're not doing the monk. This is not. It's not that kind of Asian themed. Mystic, I might. I mean, a part of me wants to do the Mystic just simply because I love Dark Sun, but it'd be a lot of work getting that to do right, and I don't. Paladin is a maybe, but I might prefer it as a fighter subclass. Switching the Paladin over to a fighter subclass gives it much more combat focus and much less support focus, which is good because because there's a general set and trend I would set to make support hard to come by. So yeah, you can get the healing because paladin spells and stuff, but you're not going to get, the aura of Shazam or, the random laying on hands. I mean, you do need a solid support subclass. That isn't just healing, but I'm not saying that the paladin does it wrong. I'm saying that the paladin does it wrong in this setting. Yeah, Dodo. Every class has the option that you pick at some level from 1 to 3 that like sets the several class features down the line. That's what I'm referring to as a subclass. Like wizards have their schools, bards, as I recall, have colleges. Paladins have oaths, right? It's those things. It does make it really easy to kit bash the classes because those really are the things that the game wants you to set, right? It doesn't. The game doesn't so much want you monkeying around with the core class features, but making a new subclass is much easier and oftentimes does a lot of the work. All right, where was I? And although we definitely want to have at least one of these. I don't know which or how many. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I point out is like the fighter is generally like the not a mage class, but the Eldritch Knight makes it a mage class, right? Not a lot of spell casting, but you do actually get wizard spell casting as the Eldritch Knight. It does allow you to retask a lot of stuff about the class without actually changing any of its real core features. You still get all the same extra attacks. You still get the what is it called? Action surge. You still get the many ability score improvements. Fighting style, all the same, right? It's all the same stuff, but those like backup abilities change around. So we have a setup here. I mean, we have a approximate setup. There are a few classes that we definitely want, or there's a couple of classes that we definitely want. We want the cleric. We want the fighter. Um, the we want an arcane spellcaster, right? One of these. We might want more than one, but I do not know. The sorcerer possibly could get reframed into the Ravenloft Witch, maybe, because the Ravenloft Witch might also be cleric subclass. Ravenloft Witch. The Ravenloft Witch, incidentally, was it was a character kit from Second Ed. If you character kits were a bit of a rat screw, but it basically added spellcasting ability to like fighters and thieves. So, I might add it over there, but it seems better as its own class. Its essential features was that it had a bit of arcane and cleric spellcasting, right? And like some understanding of like underlying things in the world. They gained insight. I mean, hypothetically, the mystic would also be able to pull that off. it would be so much work to make that work. So what do people think? I had the idea that being an actual wizard wasn't actually like a process of education so much as a process of like careful modification of the person through iatrochemical means, alchemical processes and all of this. It's kind of like becoming a witcher, right? It's something that's done to you, essentially. And refluffing the warlock and possibly changing around some of its abilities to reflect that. Alternatively, I might just go with a wizard and just have the standard arcanist does magic. Right. I'm not sure which way I want to go on this one. And once again, I'm in that condition of thought that grabs a hold of your throat and keeps you from speaking. Sometimes you get into that deep thought condition, and it just takes away your power to talk. I mean, going with just the stock wizard has the advantage of being easy, right? Nothing wrong with doing things the easy way. But there could be better ways, right? Fluffing up the warlock and maybe exchanging some of its abilities to to reflect, instead of being somebody who's in a pact with a higher power, somebody who's been warped from a young age. Has a lot. I mean, there's a lot of story in that, right? It does run into the problem that, the wizard is the default versatile spellcasting class. Warlocks aren't that versatile in their spellcasting, right? It's a much more limited spellcasting class. So if I go one or the other, I could theoretically do both, but the concept for the warlock is that you kind of have to do it. So it is kind of boiling down to one or the other. You know what? At this point, it is occurring to me, I have been streaming and doing this for 5 hours. I think I need to let the thoughts percolate, because I am hitting a bit of a block. And, I mean, you can work through a writer's block, but oftentimes the product of it isn't worth keeping. So it's better to get the rest. So I have saved this. It is all saved. And here we are in the second day of our development, and it occurs to me that I haven't zoomed in, which means that the text is probably entirely illegible to you. Where do I find that? That would be view. Yes, I know how to computer. I do. 200%. That should make it legible. Last time we managed to get about 4 pages of notes in. Well, less than 4 pages. There's a lot of white space there. And, in my defense, developing this many pages of notes is an awful lot more work than it sounds. Yes, I like the title, so I steal it. But since the day before yesterday, I have been thinking about this. The first thing that I finally figured out was what to call the big bads. Might not be any specific in-game term, like in-setting term, but I wanted to have a specific term for them so that I could refer to them in the rules. And, big bad just doesn't have a good ring to it. So, and now I'm sitting here going, wow, why didn't I think of this before? Ascendant evil, obviously. All right, yes, I can think. I think good. Yeah. Evils are legendary monsters. All right. So, title achieved. And I was thinking about them to some extent. To give a recap, since I know that at least one person in the chat wasn't there last time. Basically, what we got is a world where where a person, an intelligent creature, a creature capable of making moral decisions, could decide to go down the path of evil. Unlike, rising up as a zombie or whatever, it is possible to become a lesser monster without an intentional act. But to become something truly ascendant, it must be a voluntary act. The person voluntarily chooses to become something more evil, or possibly doesn't actually know that the action will have that consequence, but does the required action, an act taken to harm others for no real benefit, unless that benefit is to gain the power of evil. Right. And I have this neat little slogan here that sounds really great in my head and probably sounds kind of lame otherwise. The act is its own reward. That's what it has to be. The act has to be its own reward. And then they essentially become a legendary monster. And a number of things occur. One of the things that occurs are these horrors of the deep. I'm thinking I'm going... a serial killer could count, actually. Provided that they aren't under some psychosis that makes them believe that there is some higher benefit that they are achieving, right? A number of serial killers actually do believe that they are doing good for the world by doing what they do. Those wouldn't count. But a serial killer who believes that this is just really fun, yeah, that would count. Hannibal Lecter may count. Jack the Ripper might not. See, the thing about Hannibal Lecter is he's always killing people that he finds reprehensible. Right. He doesn't kill people who he thinks are okay people, right? He doesn't necessarily have to like them, but he doesn't generally kill people who are, just kind of just standing there, or people who are just living their lives, right? He kills people who have offended him on some level. And depending on how that is interpreted, and it would require you to delve into his head and make decisions that were never, or for him, that were never explicitly spelled out in the books or in the movies. But if you think that he is actually killing, in one of the books, it actually mentions a lot of his backstory, which definitely fuels the fire that he's actually killing for a reason. Meanwhile, Jack the Ripper might have just hated prostitutes, right? That is the possibility. He's killing them because they're good to kill, right? They're loathsome people, and they're better off dead. And that arguably could be for no real benefit except for the glory of having killed them. I mean, again, it requires you to dive into his head in a way that we really can't, right? But, looking at it from one perspective, yes. Looking at it from one perspective, no. But these horrors of the deep, they of course do come from the ocean. At least originally. They might adapt to land. I definitely get a Salt and Sanctuary vibe off of my thoughts on this one. I'm kind of veering towards them being aberrations. I don't know if I'm going to just have them as aberrations and just have that creature type be this category. But they kind of function as the world's immune system. If there is an ascendant evil, and they will lurk at its borders and try to invade. These things are essentially the long-term consequence of becoming an ascendant evil. One of the things that I mentioned in Dark Fantasy is that they have a definite morality, but not definite rewards or punishments for that morality. Wrong choices often have greater rewards for long-term punishments, while the right choices have lesser rewards for more immediate punishments. And this is kind of the long-term punishment for them. That they will be that there will be things lurking in the shadows, not necessarily precisely aimed at them. They don't necessarily know exactly where their mark is, but they will go looking, right? They will end up mostly just killing bystanders and threatening, the world around the evil. But they eventually, if that evil isn't able to hide in a lair, isn't powerful enough to shoo them away, isn't powerful enough to defend himself, eventually they will find it and kill it. And I was actually thinking about this detail. Go down here. This leads to a natural conclusion. An ascendant evil might have a low CR, but if it does and lacks social protections or a defensible layer, it will not last for especially long. Well, I think more correctly you could say that in Ravenloft, it's basically doing the SCP thing, right? It doesn't want to destroy the evils; it wants to contain the evils. In this world, the evils, I mean, whether it's the world acting, whether there's something else at work, there's definitely something that is actively hunting down the ascendant evil, right? Yeah, it does actively prevent destruction. I would point out that by the morality of the setting, once you have become an ascendant evil, you are functionally irredeemable, right? I mean, in theory, you might be like, I've become a monster. I cannot stop being a monster. I must die! That's not quite a redemption story. I never really thought that, killing yourself is redemptive. But, I mean, yeah, sure, it's arguably a redemption story, but you're not going to shed being an ascendant evil. And we did a little bit of work elsewhere. I had this idea for fiends versus undead, right? The undead are those dead that haven't made it beyond, right? It's possible to become undead, in some cases, it's no longer the original person, blah, blah, blah. Fiends, on the other hand, I've actually worked in a little bit of cosmology. Check your highlighting. Come on. All right. Fiends are those dead people who have made it to the beyond and were not specifically called by any higher power, right? This is a very ancient view of the afterlife, right? If you aren't, specially selected by a deity, then you end up in kind of the residuary basin of the underworld, where everybody goes if they aren't tapped by a god. And I've dubbed these the Asphodel Fields based on a portion of the Greek legend, and it's basically just a place where the dead go. It's largely empty. I mean, there's stuff in it, but it's cold, it's empty, there's not a great deal. The dead eat asphodel, which in the real world is an actual flower. And after eating enough, they lose their connection to their mortal selves, start shedding their personal traits. And eventually, once every trace of their mortality is gone, they depart and maybe reincarnate. The fiends are what happens between shedding portions of their mortality and reincarnating. They are built around whatever fixations, quirks, or other features still remain of their former selves. They are oftentimes unfortunate because they are built around strongly held fixations, ideologies, notions, perversions, whatever. They are not necessarily evil, but they are generally not healthy, right? And in answer to your question, it would be more like Helheim, Mitch. It's just the place where dead people go to die, right? Or to be dead. There would be very few really powerful fiends, because very few would last that long without finally shedding the last of their mortal selves, and thus just passing on, right? There's got to be something that they're still latched onto, that they can't give up, and they just build around that more and more until it becomes more and more, probably becomes more and more diseased. So that basically, at this point, what we have is very generalized stuff. We were actually working on ideas for character classes last time when my brain juice finally ran out. After 5 hours of being creative and talking on a stream and all of that, yeah, brain juice runs out. I have put some thought into this, right? I realize forgot the rogue. Rogue definitely needs to fit. It definitely fits in on this because obviously, I mean, dark fantasy. You want to have a rogue. Fighter definitely fits in. The cleric fits in, if for no other reason, for the fantasy horror. Fantasy horror really demands at least the availability of clerics. I am looking to limit the number of classes, though, because I'm of the opinion that you don't really need all of those classes in any given setting, right? And the question that you should be asking isn't, should this be removed? The question that you should be asking is, does this need to be there, right? Why should I include this? And when you ask that question, a lot of things drop out. The bard drops out on this one, because one of the things that I commented on up here, somewhere, the environment is oppressive, and you get very little support. And bards are basically a support class. And they're a really good support class. And in particular, they're a support class capable of being supportive by being friendly, nice, and helpful. That does not sound dark fantasy at all. Now, there will probably be something bard-like that we might filter into the rogue, right? Could very well be there. Possibly, one obvious example might be a con artist, but there are other possibilities. I'm also looking at this interesting question. Sorcerers, wizards, and warlocks. 3 classes, 2 of whom do almost exactly the same thing, and 1 of whom does somewhat the same thing. I had an idea for the warlock, which I actually dropped down here. The idea of the warlock as a transhuman. This would basically be setting something down into the cosmology, right? That in order to use magic like a wizard or sorcerer would, basically requires that you be biologically altered through iatrochemistry, through arcane devices, through wonky surgeries, and all of that. And so the spellcasters are all essentially a form of fantasy transhuman. Or at least the wizards are all a form of fantasy transhuman. They're kind of like the Witcher, right? Except, instead of being devoted to killing magical things, they're devoting to being a magical thing. This would nail down a lot of the cosmology. It would also knock out the sorcerer and the wizard, because they would no longer fit the cosmology. It would also kind of mandate the inclusion of the artificer, which is a class from Unearthed Arcana. As a note, if you use classes or feats or whatever from Unearthed Arcana, you cannot publish that work. I do not know if they've published the Artificer in a source that is actually OGC. But that's something to keep in mind. If it's not OGC, you can't use it, and I don't know that the Artificer is OGC. And I made a note that the Artificer could be a way of bringing in the Ravenloft Eremite, which was, for some reason, Eremites, they called the Alchemist the Eremite. Whatever. I also had a note about the Ravenloft Witch. The Witch was just a neat concept, and it could be introduced in a number of different ways. Introducing it as the Mystic, which is basically the 5th Ed Psionicist, would be a great deal of work. Introducing it as the Sorcerer would kind of work. Alternately, I could actually introduce it as a Cleric subclass. Because the idea behind the Witch is that it is a person who has gained arcane power kind of in the way of a cleric, except instead of devotion to a deity, it is simply spiritual devotion, right? Internal, inward, spiritual devotion. And so it actually, like, fluff-wise, it kind of fits into the cleric. Definitely sounds like the Mystic. Again, the Mystic is basically the Psionicist. It's not the Sorcerer, but we can reskin the Sorcerer to fit it. So any of those might work. And this has been kind of futzing with me. I think I've narrowed it so that I know I want the Artificer, the Cleric, Fighter, and the Rogue. I'm not sure if I want any other class except one of those arcane classes. I honestly think that the 5 classes would be enough. The Artificer will require a lot of work, because they deal in magical items, and that means that we have to develop magical items for the setting, and it has to be developed in such a way that it is conducive to being used as part of a character class, and yada, yada, yada. Incidentally, if anybody has any input on this, I am perfectly happy to receive it. In fact, that is part of the reason why I'm streaming this, is to get opinions of others. I do like the Witcher concept, and I'm kind of leaning towards going the Warlock route. Oh, that's fine, right? I'm not insisting that you contribute. I'm just saying, if you have a contribution, please don't hesitate. I kind of like the idea that, instead of the wizard being this bookish person who sits there in his room and reads a bunch of books and then gains magical power, and it all comes from himself, that the wizard is actually somebody who had it put on him, and maybe didn't even have a choice in it, right? This could be some random peasant that had some brain power, and some noble said, well, we're grabbing you, we're making you a spellcaster, and didn't really have a choice in the matter, right? It is an entertaining twist on it, that the wizards of this setting might not actually have a choice, or might not have had a choice but to have gained that power. Yes, there is also the fact that it would make them like The Witcher, and The Witcher is awesome. Right. That thought never crossed my mind. Not once. I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, no. It's not that. So I think I'm going to go with the Warlock and probably rename it. Yes, that implication would be there. And, I mean, whether you want to say that that's actually true or not, I would leave that to the judgment of the Witchlock. Yeah, no, that's not going to work. I might just go with Arcanist, as that is, like, a Ravenloft class. The original Arcanist absolutely sucked. But it was kind of an appropriate idea that there would be a spellcaster devoted to doing spellcasting a la Ravenloft. But, you know, making a Dark Powers check per level, and every time you cast a spell from one of your favored schools, of which you have 2. Yeah, there were all kinds of problems with that class. Still, you know, the Arcanist might also be warped typing. It's helpful. Or warp witch. If we want to get really funky, bloodbender. Although that people will start thinking Avatar at that point. But I think we have like our 5 classes, and we have a few subclasses. I have stuff about the Avenger. The Avenger is an old Ravenloft class, and they had a few interesting or they had one ability which wasn't nearly enough for the XP cost of the class. But I refer to it as the Vendetta State. They didn't name it. Basically, they can walk up and be like, yeah, drawing aggro, temp hit points, hit me. I would love to augment that with retributive strikes, that they do extra damage to someone who has damaged them in the previous round. And a favorite enemy is also a possibility. It would make perfect sense for the Avenger. There's some kind of foe that they're really good at taking down. Probably humanoid. I never did like the fact that you could take broad classes of favored enemies unless they were humanoid. That never made a lot of sense to me. So I could be really good at killing all monstrosities or one type of humanoid. Really? Do you know how broad that monstrosity category? We're ignoring aberrations at this point, which could be any freaking thing in the world. So this might get reflavored or remixed if I use it, but it is a possibility. And so that goes down there under the Avenger, or under the Fighter. So basically by Raw, they can take people who fuck with me, practically. Well, no, it's quite the opposite, right? If you want a humanoid favored enemy, then you have to pick specifically, elves. Or, humans. On the other hand, you could just take, if you want to be able, let's look at the list of monstrosities to see what all counts as a monstrosity. Cockatrice, Dark Mantle, Piercer, Rust Monster, Warg, Death Dog, Harpy, Hippogriff, Ankheg, Carrion Crawler, Centaur, Ettercap, Griffin, Marrow. The fucking Mimic is one of these things. I mean, the Phase Spider counts among them, along with the Yuan Ti. But if you pick humanoid, then you can't. Your favorite enemy isn't an elf if you favor humans, because they are that much different from each other. Clearly, so different that they can have kids with each other. Anyway, I mean, clearly, their heart. Well, we all know that elves don't have their heart in the right place, so clearly it's where their liver should be. But the Avenger would fall into this. We might have some kind of paladin replacement. I do not know if we would give it actual spells. I would say that either giving it spells or giving it some of the paladin aura and laying on of hands abilities, but not both. I prefer the paladin under fighter, especially in this setting, simply because it makes their focus, fighting. As opposed to the paladin's focus, which is to be awesome and invigorating to their allies while fighting. That is a problem with them, right? They have so much resistance to stuff, and they can give so much resistance to stuff, that it takes the edge off of a lot of things. I'm still going to put a question mark around this. The rogue might have a bard version. Definitely, let's just say a Tomb Raider type. Probably not going to call it an actual Tomb Raider because, you can't wield dual pistols. I do not know the reference that you are making. I am sorry. For the cleric, it'd be, by faiths. We probably want to have an anchorite. Clerics of Ezra. Ezra was one of the deities in Ravenloft. Discworld. I am not that familiar with Discworld, sadly. Ezra was one of the deities of Ravenloft. Actually, one of the cooler things they did, and the Anchorite class almost pulled its weight, right? Of all the classes that they made for Ravenloft, the Anchorite in 2nd Ed almost worked. They did get some neat abilities. The Shield of Ezra was actually kind of a neat one. But it's too, I have up here Ravenloft elements. So we want to have an equivalent to, and I want to have an equivalent of the Anchorite because it's kind of the definitive, Ravenloft cleric. We want to have a druidish faith, but not the fucking druids. I am not a big fan of the druid class, honestly, which is one of the reasons why I'm ruling them out. And maybe other faiths semi-based on Ravenloft or other available ideas, and possibly worship of the horrors of the deep. The Artificer is, personally, I would give them specialties and what kind of magical items they can make. You can have eremite, alchemist, potioner. Want to have some kind of wizardish, a mechanical wizard. Staffs and wands. An artificer who can produce staffs and wands and thus gains wizard abilities from it, can gain some of those warlock spells, arcanist spells, whatever we call it, without having their bodies utterly mutilated by the process, right? And then some kind of artisan who can make weapons, armors, perhaps some miscellanies. Basically can make ordinary things, but magical. I'm gonna make a note here. No bags of holding. I hate bags of holding. Use magic device. Use magic device. There really isn't a use magic device skill in 5th Ed. There's kind of one, in that if you are using an item that requires you to, that needs you to make a magical attack roll, or requires a spell DC, and you don't have one, then you don't get to apply your proficiency bonus to it. And I have to read it again. You might not even be able to apply an ability modifier to it. So to a limited extent, that's your use magic device. And it might be worth having like a arcane device proficiency or something like that, like adding a proficiency for staffs and wands and other spellcasting things. Oh, I just suddenly thought. Token crafter, scrolls. I don't like scrolls. Not that I dislike the idea of somebody who, like, an expendable cast a spell item. I just don't like the scroll concept. And it's fluff rather than crunch, but yeah, probably reframing that. But you want to have some. I mean, that would be the other mechanical wizard, right? Doesn't actually cast the spell, but makes the things that cast the spells. That's what both of them do. The token crafter makes consumables, where the mechanical wizard makes the durable items. And they can be surprisingly durable, since in 5th ed they actually recharge charges on their own. When I saw that, I'm sitting there like, good god. Back in 2nd ed, DMs would be vomiting split pea soup at this notion. Oh. I am reminded, Ranger. No spells. I understand that in some settings, I believe Forgotten Realms is one of them, Rangers with spells make perfect sense. It doesn't make sense in a lot of settings. The worst case, I think, is in Dark Sun, where Rangers still had spells, despite the fact that they had no relationship to the Elemental Lords, no clear method of channeling the elemental powers that they were channeling, and there was no relationship between them and clerics or druids of any kind. And in this setting, I don't think rangers need spells. They would instead gain survival. And one of the things that we kind of established, dark fantasy tends to have a really untamed wild. Right. The deep wild is essentially something of a monster wall. Right. Horrible things happen if you go too deep into the forest. I mean, yes, it is kind of a level gate. If you're awesome enough to power through it, you can power through it. But still, horrible things happen out there. The ranger suddenly becomes somewhat more useful if you're going out there. Although probably Ranger and Paladin will get renamed, along with the Bard. Actually, I just had an entertaining concept. The rogue class might actually include a gentleman or a member of the court, or somebody who is capable of rubbing elbows with the First Estate. That would be an awesome class, and that would very much fit the dark fantasy. Dark fantasy is oftentimes a political game, right? One might actually refer to it as a throne game, or a game of, yeah. And so having a rogue class that is like a member of the court would work really nicely. For the Arcana warped people, I'd say it'd be based on effects, based on focus of effects, and I could see actually a few. I oftentimes play with this idea. I don't know, it might not work, but the Trap Weaver. An arcanist who doesn't, or who, I mean, might cast spells directly, but who generally casts spells onto an area that trigger when somebody breaks the boundary of that area. Right? This would function kind of like Glyph of Warding, which would mean that I want to limit it, because Glyph of Warding is a mid-level spell, and a first-level Trap Weaver shouldn't be able to just churn out Glyphs of Warding. But with the proper limitations, I think it may work. As this will be a question mark, because if I can't get it to balance, it goes away. also want to have a war mage because, you know, it's dark fantasy. It's all about the blood and guts. Have a conjurer. Note, to conjure is not to create or to summon, but to bind to your will. Give or take, right? Different stories go different ways on those proportions, but give or, you know, something like that, right? But yeah, we're talking dark fantasy and we're talking, you know, spellcaster. There will be some whose entire purpose is to bind people and perhaps even objects to their will. Probably want an assassin. So we have 3 or 4 subclasses for each of these, which I think is sufficient, even if some of them are, you know, God only knows if we're actually going to use it. I mean, heck, we've got an entire class where it's like God only knows if we're ever going to use it. And I think this kind of paints us a picture of what the what the PCs are going to look like. As a note, I'm definitely preferring a mostly or entirely human setting. This isn't to say that there might not be, you know, intelligent NPCs that are not human. But for PCs, you know, dark fantasy tends to be very, very human, right? You don't tend to have, you know, the elves as part of the adventuring party, or, you know, the dwarves actually being, you know, friendly and reliable. And, you know, they might not exist at all. So if there are non-human concepts, they will not be common. And I will not encourage their use. Which probably means the alternate human. Feat proficiency. Since we're not getting any leverage or mileage or plot whatever off of the different races, you know, we want to encourage the kind of diversity that we get in D&D somehow, and this is really the way to do it. Rather than just giving all humans a flat +1 to all ability scores, give them a free feat and a free proficiency. That will give you a lot of the diversity that you'd probably be looking for, because the characters will each have something unique, right? And this, I think, gives us a view of... Oh, wait. Almost forgot. The witch. I think we can clear this stuff out now. So we have a breakdown of classes that we're going to be using, including some notes on subclasses. These classes will probably be changed around a little bit. In slight ways. I don't plan on doing anything really major to alter them, but minor things switched around. Like, I don't like the idea of Thieves' Cant. That might change. I might keep it. I might not. Yeah, I never liked the idea of a full-on Thieves Guild, right? A criminal syndicate is one thing, but the Thieves Guild kind of implies that it is actually a non-partisan organization, right? Like, lots of thieves, including thieves on opposite ends of conflicts, are a part of a Thieves Guild. Which does not make... I mean, it does make sense to me in some cases, right? You have a criminal underworld, it is a community. Okay, sure, it might kind of be like a guild, but it doesn't make sense to me in a lot of settings, right? Like, if you're in Waterdeep and you're a member of a Thieves Guild, guess what? You're working for Xanthar. That is not a non-partisan organization. that is definitely an organization devoted to the will of Xanthar. So, I mean, you might have a criminal syndicate that's backing you. That's entirely possible, perfectly acceptable, probably not going to go the way you hope. But, like, yeah, no, I don't like the guild. The Thieves Guild is suffering a strike. They want better pay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it occurs to me. Probably want just a straight up soldier. I'm actually going to add to this. I don't know if I'm going to keep that because that's not especially D&D-ish. But it's an idea. Right? You have a fixer, somebody who removes evidence of crimes and smooths over public opinion. That's kind of bardish, but it's the kind of bardish that works in a dark fantasy setting. This is somebody who, makes the public okay with the horrible, horrible people that they are working for. So now we've got a breakdown of the kinds of characters that we're going to be looking at. Yeah, face classes are really important in games like this. It's funny because in the dark fantasy, you want to have a face class, whereas in the really bright and shiny fantasy, it's at best optional. And possibly also get it out of the paladin type or the soldier type. Clerics can do it. Yeah, in the bright and shiny fantasy world, people are happy to see you. In the dark fantasy world, people are happy to see you if you've got something to offer them.